So over to you.
Excellent. All right, perfect. Well, I'm thrilled to have so many experts here with me. So I'm going to throw out a couple of questions to you both, just to kick us off, right? So obviously participation is a blessing and a curse for all of us in annual giving, and something that we, for a very, very long time, have been focused on. Let me start with, in previous roles or current roles, if you were to have a conversation with your president or your board of trustees and ask them what the priority was, what would they tell you? Would they say donors? Would they say dollars? Would they say something else?
They'd say yes.
Right, that's what I was going to say. Both.
Yes, exactly, right. So it's so funny to me that this seems to be a much more general experience than I would anticipate, right? Because arguably participation in dollars require two different strategies. So in sort of planning, I'll ask Catherine first. In sort of planning to attack something like this, in terms of defining participation for your institution, how do you get around to that kind of strategic thinking if you have kind of competing priorities?
No, I completely understand what you're talking about there, because it's true. There is this real impetus to see growth in both areas for good and valid reasons. Some maybe that make a little bit more sense than others, but I mean, I find when we go through our strategic planning process that there's a real what we really have to do is we have to kind of set as our key priorities a couple of different components. For us, there is that donor participation component and a focus on spendable funds throughout the university. And then the other piece that we really focus on has to do with our Colgate fund, or our unrestricted fund. While we raise lots of spendable dollars for the university in more restricted accounts, and we have some priority funds that we take into consideration. It's that unrestricted dollars that it's so important that we're driving participation into that unrestricted fund, because that is really the lifeblood of the university, and how in times like today, this is how universities are making important decisions and doing really important work, is with that unrestricted money. So while sometimes I find it to be a little bit frustrating to have such a focus on participation, I do think that thinking about participation in your unrestricted fund is really important, because you have to continue to build that base. You have to continue to find those alumni or those donors who are going to, in time, become the folks that are making those significant contributions and making your annual fund thrive, because it's important. It's really important. So we kind of segment in those two ways. We look at donor participation in general. We think about ways that we can drive participation, especially in smaller segments, more difficult segments like recent alumni, where there's great opportunity, like in milestone reunion years, another interesting piece to be considering right now. And really how that participation is then feeding into the dollars that we are generating for the annual fund. And what strategies can we take that maybe they don't always increase donor numbers, because one of the things that we're doing a lot of this year is thinking about second asks, which is not going to increase my donor numbers, but it's going to continue to drive that annual fund unrestricted dollar that is so crucial right now. So we have to do a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. Kerry, I think it's a great first question to just talk about how do we accomplish that. And you know, there's the philosophical discussion a lot these days about should we be focused on participation at all. I think some people get very strident saying why is that a metric? And I guess in my opinion, I don't fault the institutions if they value that broad base of support, and if they like the idea of it takes a village to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. But at the same time, it can get depressing these days when we're graduating bigger classes every year, and that number, you have to run faster just to stay in the same place. Yes. And as obviously the oldest one in this discussion, I can remember when, if you were focused on participation or you were focused on moving people up the pyramid, the strategies weren't all that different when it was just the phone calls and mailings and personal visits with folks. These days, with social media and everything else that we're going to touch on in this session, if you're focused on participation, I would say go that way. But if you're focused on moving people up the pyramid, I'd say go that way, right? So that makes it even more complicated, that it's hard to overlap as much as I think we used to be able to get away with. But I don't fault places for embracing participation. Every time we have this conference, I ask the audience who's got a boss or whomever that is focused on it, and more hands go up than not. And I'm not here to have a pity party about this cross we have to bear of participation, right? But it's a worthwhile goal. I think I heard Catherine say, just as long as you're not spending $100 to raise $1 from a new donor, and spending all your time sending out socks to everybody. And but there's the philosophical difference, and then the operational side of how we address that, right? All right, I'll shut up about that. Christina, anything to add to that?
No, I think I really appreciate what Catherine was saying, which, like, regardless of whether it's a mandate from leadership or not, making sure you have a broad base of support is important, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to build a pipeline. We're all trying to accomplish what we're working towards, which is to support whatever the highest priority for the institution is. And so the more people that do that, the better. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really love actually how, Catherine, you drew the connection, especially in times like these. I think I see a lot of schools, my own included, that are kind of shifting that unrestricted ask to a student emergency fund ask, right? Which is valid and noble, but I think it somewhat steals kind of the lead, right, from the unrestricted definition. And I wonder if we're losing an opportunity to educate a broad base of support about what we actually do and why it's important. So no, great, excellent, thank you. So speaking of, because of participation rates, right, I think this moves into the next logical question: how do you measure it, and are we measuring it correctly? I think Bob shared, Sue Cunningham from CASE sent out a great note last fall, kind of advocating for a different measurement metric. Why don't we dig into that? How do you measure it? Because every institution is slightly different. Do you see a valid purpose in continuing to measure it this way? Or do you think we should find other means of kind of defining how alumni are engaged with our institution? Oh.
You have to be like a radio talk show host. Declare who needs to answer that question next.
Excellent. Let's go to Christina.
Yeah, I would say so. Right now, I mean, in my role, I don't have any direct experience doing this right now. So, so that
shouldn't have picked Christina.
It is okay. I'll do my finest here. So I think that being said, though, what we need to consider is just the idea of engagement. And I think what is appreciated across the board is having a standard definition. But we'll never, I mean, not to be a Debbie Downer, but it's never going to happen. So how do we, at least as professionals, come up with our own sort of participation bill of rights? You know what I mean? Like description that we across the board can understand and accept, even if organizations that are evaluating this at a higher level, or if VSE doesn't change, how does that actually impact? So, but I would say I don't have like feet on the ground right now experience doing this, so maybe a little less valid from me on this one.
All right, over to Catherine then.
Well, in terms of, I mean, participation as it stands, the current definition as it stands right now, which, I mean, even though we have a definition and even though there are standards, I still know that universities count things in different ways. And so I still say that it's a little bit of the Wild West and you count the way that you count. We include all alumni who are making gifts, and we include reunion registration in that as well, because we do have a gift component to that. I think that there's real validity in that, because an alum who's making a financial commitment to come to reunion, which at our institution is not inexpensive, and a time commitment to come to campus. It's not like we're going to them and doing something, they're coming to us. I think that's really valid. I actually had a conversation with my AVP about this morning, because knowing about these thoughts that CASE has put forward about shifting from an alumni participation ranking to an alumni engagement ranking. We found that to be a delightful concept at Colgate. We've been doing work to create an alumni engagement index for a number of years now. Our alumni relations office has been working with the NEAR cohort, that Northeast Alumni Relations cohort, to work to kind of get out ahead of this idea of how do you measure and quantify alumni engagement. And then they were also involved in conversations with CASE about how to standardize such a thing. Because you're right, it's going to be a difficult thing to standardize. And so much of it's going to depend on a university's technological tools. Like, what are they, because online engagement is a piece of it. And everyone, if your tools are different and they're counting people in different ways, and how do you know who's engaging? So that's, you know, it's easy enough to count the people in a room at an event. Like, it's really hard to count the people who are logging into your website and doing whatever they may be doing. So that creates a whole nother fun set of challenges and disparities between universities and colleges. But it's the same thing I think we're facing right now with participation, because we do count those things differently. Oh wait, I had some other train of thought and I totally lost it. So as we were thinking about the idea of, in time, perhaps moving from strictly looking at gift participation and broadening that to engagement, I think that would be such a fabulous indicator of what a university's value to their alumni body really is. Similar to the way that an arts organization or a membership organization looks at their biggest broad of support is their one-time purchasers, and then it goes to their membership folks, and then it goes to the people that are giving. We're kind of cutting off the bottom of our pyramid because we're starting just with the donors, and we have this huge swath of alumni who are engaging with us in different ways, and we're not counting them when we're thinking about the quality of service that we provide to alumni or the affinity that they have for the education that they received at their university. So I definitely think it's the right thing to go. I will sit in my little room and advocate for it. And I'm excited that donor participation continues to be a part of that conversation, as well it should be. That is a clear indication of affinity and engagement and value. But I don't think it's the only one.
Yeah, I wonder if, you know, the world is moving so quickly, and there are other ways now to engage with your places that you value, right? This metric of alumni participation, I wonder if it's just a little dated. Like we really, VSC, I think, needs to catch up with us in a lot of ways, just on a basic level of like how people make gifts now, right? There are certain types of gifts that aren't necessarily included in that calculation. And then moving forward, I mean, social media becomes, especially now in this sort of new day and age, right? The idea of virtual engagement is something I'm sure all of our constituencies are thinking about and doing, because we've had to kind of push to that next level. What does this mean for the future? I don't know.
You know, I always like claiming Michael Bloomberg as an annual giving success story, because his first gift to Johns Hopkins was $5 the year after he graduated. But, you know, the truth is he's a great engagement story too, right? That Johns Hopkins was smart enough to get him on a committee and get him involved up to here on the board and show him the blueprints for the next building they wanted to build. So the irony to me is that what keeps participation so prominent is that's the number you can count, especially if you're doing peer-to-peer comparisons, right? So part of the timing of Sue Cunningham's message was that CASE was launching their new alumni support metric platform online. But that still leaves a big old can of worms, that what happens when two institutions aren't doing the same thing from an engagement point of view. And Catherine is just scratching the surface on all the social media scoring that you could do, but 95% of the places that I get to, that's way beyond their capacity, right? So philosophically, I think we all should agree that there's a lot of ways to build relationships with people. But for better or worse, participation in annual giving is the best black and white one that everybody's counting in some respect. Although, so talk a little out of school with staff. You're all sort of on the honor system, how you report participation, right? I mean, that seems to have become a frustration, not specific to staff, but I mean, there's nobody sort of auditing anybody's participation rates either. which only makes it worse.
It's totally true. It's hard, I think, to understand. Yeah, it's not apples to apples. It's, you know, some obscure fruit to some other obscure vegetable sometimes. But it is on the honor system. I think to your point, Bob, it's a measurable, right? We live in a land of measurables. Our board loves measurables. I think maybe we can take a little bit more qualitative information. I think it would serve us better if we could, you know, maybe interpret it as quantitative. But that's coming. I hope.
and for everybody listening in who doesn't have the luxury of going back to their boss and saying participation is so dated.
True, exactly. So while this is a philosophical conversation, I am a participation advocate. I believe in it. At CMC, you know, we're gunning for top tier participation. Last year we fell just short of 40%, and so our sights are set high. We're looking for 50% participation. So to get there, you know, I think that there are a couple of strategies, right? One, you have to think kind of short term, and one, you have to think long term. So let's start in the short term for folks that need to go back to their boss and say, I've got an idea. I know how to fix this COVID-19 crisis. We're going to end the year in a brilliant participation place. Let's start there. Catherine, do you have any kind of short-term recommendations for folks?
Oh boy.
Catherine, over to you.
Yeah, let me tell you how to fix this.
Way to frame the question, Kerry.
I mean, I think one of the
and
things
we're recording.
Yeah. So then I'll go back and do it myself. One of the things that we took some time to do immediately as the world kind of started to shift over the last couple of weeks was to take a close look at our donor history, our folks that are our most engaged consecutive years donors, and their regular giving habits, and we kind of dialed back from there to get a real sense of, realistically, given where we are in the face of the world right now, what really makes sense and where we might land this year, because I don't think it's reasonable that we all stick to our goals that we set in July or August or June. The world's just shifted a little bit. But then I think in terms of short-term participation right at this moment, the place where we should be focusing, or it makes sense to focus a lot of energy and efforts, is exactly what you said earlier, Kerry. A number of universities are getting out messages around student emergency funds or those immediate needs. Colgate chose not to go with that kind of more restricted emergency fund message, and instead to leave it with a broader Colgate fund message. Right now, it is annual giving dollars that are making it possible for universities, colleges to make those very quick and nimble decisions around moving students offline, or rather moving students off campus, bringing new technology on board to support faculty if that's the case that may be needed, supporting staff who are now working remotely in lovely rooms all across the country. I mean, there's a lot of things that had to happen very, very quickly. And I know that at my institution, and I would imagine at many, many others, the funds that allowed those things to happen were unrestricted funds. And this is the time to explain why those unrestricted funds are so necessary and vital. To thank the people that have been giving to those funds, because they got you to where you are now, and then to push forward that message of, and now we need your help in taking these next steps. Because while it's true that maybe we've moved people off campus, our classes are getting started, there's more to come. There's going to be more consequences from this. Not to mention the fact we just don't know what the world is going to offer us in 3 months or 6 months or a year. And maybe it'll be some wonderful opportunity that we want to take advantage of, and not that we're reacting to something more dire. But it's those unrestricted funds that make that possible. And this is such a great time to tell that story and to really engage alumni around that message. And I think short term, that's where a lot of opportunity lies.
Definitely.
I say
yeah, Christina, go ahead.
replace the socks with toilet paper.
I
don't know.
I get the concerns about being so specific on student emergency funds and something that's a short-term need. There's an irony with this to me that in the last couple of years, I've started to see appeal letters, maybe not any of yours, that talk about student emergencies before we had this real emergency, and things that included, the food needs of kids. And that made me nervous that was a different case for support for our institutions than I'd seen before, and potentially troubling that, we all get beat up for our tuition and stuff like that. And then to make the message that, well, and then the kids can't even afford all their meals. I struggle with that student emergency theme. New paragraph. This is a different sort of proposition. And because we're better equipped to do some follow-up strategizing for the people who raised their hands this time, I think that's a different place than we might have been a couple of years ago when we were all about annual fund, annual fund, annual fund. I mean, to see who the donors are that will raise their hand for this thing, even hopefully when this thing goes away, there's still things you might be able to think about what to do with them. My opinion.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, short term is tough, right? I think president's leadership, they always want kind of that unicorn or that shiny object, right, to kind of fix things, right, and move it forward. But on a tactical level, in outside of, I think, where we are right now, I do focus on, specific kind of areas of the program that could be underperforming, right? I think in terms of participation, we talked about it before, the idea that there are kind of different strategies for dollars versus donors. I look at kind of the validity of my leadership gift program. If participation is really the big thing, right? How many resources am I allocating to that leadership gift program? Is it possible that I can pull that person off the road temporarily and have them staff a couple of classes or something like that to boost participation in those classes? What's your retention strategy, right? I think while we're trying to kind of continually climb this ladder of finding more donors, we have to remember kind of the core, those folks at CMC, we're lucky to have close to an 80% retention rate every single year. We wouldn't be able to have those participation numbers if we didn't have that fundamental foundation of donors. And then of course, senior class, I think, is probably a great quick hit. You can do it in a year and you can figure out, right, if it's working, if you're making the right choices to inform these students, and educating them, right, so that they do actually give back to you. All right, so that's short term. How about long term? So we keep talking about every year, right? We start from zero, July 1. Personally, I love it. It's a great rush and a great challenge every single year, right? So how do you build upon that, right? How do you have a long-term strategy if you're looking for some target participation? In our case, we're looking for 50%. How do we get there? Because it can't happen, right, in isolation a year at a time. Christina, do you want to be the first one to start?
Sure, definitely. So I think, and this is, I'm going to talk in kind of a land of no budgets, because that would be ideal. So, but I think especially if there's a goal that is so aspirational, that is also highly touted and supported and demanded by leadership, then there needs to be budgetary resources put towards that. So there is a lot of opportunity using data, using kind of an unfettered artistic approach to getting to higher participation rates. And there are schools who are doing this out there. And so I think the idea that it's not possible is not true, and but it takes resources and it takes a commitment to do it. And I think that's the thing to remember. Like, don't beat yourself up over it if it's not happening the way you want it to, but long term, it's advocating for finding solutions or getting letters, I guess, getting like case studies from other institutions who are doing this and showing how it works. So that would be what I have to share on that one.
Excellent. Catherine.
I think, yeah, I think really right along those lines, having resource to diversify and develop real concrete strategy around your participation efforts is really important. I think in terms of some of the strategies that different institutions could consider to help build that pipeline, recurring giving, I think, is an obvious one, because if you can get people into a pattern of giving where it becomes automatic and what your work then becomes to go back to them and ask for increases, that makes it so when you start on whatever your day is, for me it's July 1st, I don't start at 0. I start with this healthy number of people already in my queue, and that begins to push you ahead. Now, my recurring giving program is not as strong as I want it to be, and it's something we're continuing to work on. A big part of it has to do with our CRM and our technology and how we can capture and steward and track these donors appropriately. So not to say it's something you can just snap your fingers and do, but I think it's one piece that other organizations are doing really well, and colleges and universities have ample opportunity to improve on. I think also that, similar to your school, Kerry, we have about a 79% live hunt retention rate, and the overwhelming majority of those people come from our consecutive years giving society. We all know there's tons of data that shows that once you have someone who's giving consecutively for so many years, the chances that they're going to renew become exponentially higher. And once you lose them, they drop down drastically. So I think that focusing resource into paying close attention to your consecutive year givers and encouraging them to maintain that momentum, whether that's human resource, if you've got that ability, or it's marketing resource, if that's where you are able to put some extra effort or extra money, as it comes down to, basically, that's a place where you can make significant strides. And again, when you start on July 1, you're not starting in such a difficult place, because you've had these people in your foundation, in your pool for however many years, and you can rely on them. When I was looking at my projections for where I was going to end this year, I started with that group of our most reliable donors, and I knew I should dial back their retention rate a little bit, but I didn't dial it back a whole lot, because these are the people that stick with us through the thick and thin, that stuck with us through the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So giving a lot of attention to those people and continuing to build that cohort makes it so that you're not starting at 0 again every year. And then I think diversifying your marketing as much as possible. It used to be not that long ago that so much of our work was sending letters, right, and making phone calls, and that was it. When I started doing this, the idea of sending an email to someone and asking them for money was completely crazy. And now, I mean, and I'm not that old, but like, yeah, like send an email to someone, like that's nuts. And now it's so much of the work that I do. So I think it's important that, very much to Christina's point about investing resources, you have to think about diversifying how you're connecting with people. The world, the market is busy, it's loud, there's so much competition for people's attention and for their dollars and for their philanthropic proclivities, that you have to talk to them often. You have to talk to them in different ways. You have to repeat your message over and over and over again. And one letter is not going to do it. And one email won't do it. And you can't send one email and call it a failure, because that's not fair to you. Like, you're competing with so much. So you have to really find ways to talk to people through different channels, delivering the same message, because consistency and repetition is so important in the world that we live in right now.
Just to follow on Catherine's, and I'll actually give you an answer to your short-term question and your long-term question, that one of the short-term things it seems to me we could do right now, and social media is the cost-effective gateway to do it, is to remind people of all the themes that we bring up when we're asking them to make a gift. So whether it's, nostalgia, or the voice of a peer, or the quality of your institution, or the needs of whomever, you could have a steady sort of stream of those messages without even asking anybody for a gift, but just to kind of reinforce those ideas for when we decide that it's go time again with actually asking for a gift. And that doesn't have to be an expensive mailing. It doesn't have to be in the phone room, but that's a good way, it seems to me, to just keep beating that drum and reinforce ideas that we're going to come back to when you get your next appeal. And then the longer term idea, which you said so nicely, Catherine, about how we have to keep evolving along with our audiences, and the sand's always shifting underneath us. And Kerry, I have promised people for a couple days now that when I got you into this session, I was going to bring this up because anytime I'm on FundList or speaking at a conference and I bring up something like Venmo as an alternative payment option, and I really think we're going to see the day where there's somebody in the gift processing office who's the dedicated alternative payment specialist, right? So and every time I bring it up, somebody will say some variation of "you're not allowed to do that," or "it's illegal," or so you're not shy at Claremont McKenna at promoting using Venmo to make a gift. So for once and for all, so I have something to take back to these other people. And by the way, you're not alone, I'm sure you know. So I've seen Vassar in Virginia and a bunch of other places that now folded into their appeals. What's the answer to the question of how does Claremont McKenna get away with that? Because some people are surprised you haven't been arrested already.
Well, I feel like for all out there, including our legal team, I have to say that I am not a legal professional by any means.
But I also don't think Venmo's going around trying to arrest anybody either.
No, so the piece about Venmo is that we operate an institutional Venmo account. So, we essentially got in early enough that it was capable to kind of spin off, subgroups off of a main institutional account. Okay. I was not here when it was set up, so I can only speak to what we do now. But we try to use it with targeted audiences, specifically our seniors, specifically our students. Personally, I'm actually looking even forward further because I think that Apple Pay and Google Pay and a lot of the mobile payment options are really the direction that we should look. To kind of bring this all together, I'm a huge advocate of it's not necessarily one specific ask. Yes, right time, right amount is very important, but to Catherine's point, in this society right now, there's so much noise that it's really not one communication, it's the arc of communication, right? And I think a lot of our for-profit peers have been further out ahead of us dramatically, looking at things like attribution modeling, trying to understand, specifically what is driving someone's response. So it's the whole, it's not necessarily specific. And I think that also applies to a long-term approach. One of the pieces that I feel like all annual giving directors, when you get them in a room, they all lament that they wish they had more time for stewardship, especially when it comes down to, the concept of kind of renewable giving or recurring giving. I'm very lucky to say that CMC invested in that very early on, and that's part of the reason why we are so consistent. But I would really love to be able to do more in a stewardship capacity, because I think that we struggle with kind of that specialness, so to speak, of giving our donors what they want now, not what they wanted 20 years ago, right? They want more information, they want more impact notes, they want more and a better understanding of what we're actually doing. So all in all, Venmo aside,
well, it just, because I'm the one who thrust the microphone in your face on this subject, right? I mean, let me just tell you my understanding. I think Venmo officially, has in writing that we don't allow big organizations to be using it. I think the reason they came up with that language is they didn't want the Red Cross and other big charities, on TV promoting. They want to have a separate conversation with Red Cross about their partnership, right? I don't think they're interested in going after senior gift programs or class reunion giving programs. And, you're certainly not the only ones at Claremont McKenna who sort of figured out a way that we could get that onto a postcard. So that's not to ask you to explain yourself. It's to say, I think you're just the leading edge of what's going to be probably an official change of language on PayPal's part or Venmo's part, and just a critical mass of everybody who's using it with recent graduates or whomever. So I'll shut up about it, but I promote you guys. I have a slide that I showed in a session yesterday about how it's on the postcard, and that, to go back to the long-term thinking, that's how I think we need to treat this. We get outside the box, right?
Yes, well, I think to Catherine's point, like we have to evolve, right? Our donors are evolving, our own experience is evolving, right? Like I love Amazon. Amazon knows what I want before I want it. Why can't we do that as an institution, right? We have a relationship with these individuals. We need to kind of meet them where they are. Excellent. So, other metrics. As we're talking about participation, we mentioned a couple of other metrics that we track, but beyond that, are there other metrics that we should think about that may, one, do someone a service who's listening to this to say, you know, participation is not the be all end all, right? There are other sort of barometers to define a healthy program, but also on the other side, what are some helpful metrics that may feed into kind of that participation portion? Do you want me to start with you, Bob?
Keep pointing. Well done. You know, I'll just say what didn't exist when I started doing this was anything like affinity scoring and engagement scoring, and that has made so much of our work smarter, just in being able to understand who's got a pulse maybe, and who seems to be demonstrating some continuing interest in us. And so this again goes back to the point Catherine made, but all those metrics about who opens your email, what things do they read in your email, who posts a comment somewhere, you know, who identifies some affinity with you. And we're not naturally equipped to track all that stuff still. And maybe one of the things you do while the virus is sorting itself out is get smarter, up your game about stuff like that. But I think that only helps with the efficiency of what we're doing once it comes time to ask people for a gift, is to figure out, you know, how many new likes do we get? How many new friends do we get? How many new comments do we get? How many new email openers do we get? That all feeds into that pipeline of about what's going to make our fundraising more efficient.
I think one of the things that brings up is also just like the power of our CRMs, and how can we capture all that and keep it together, knowing that we're all using these different platforms now that don't speak to each other necessarily. And so how do we sort of pressure the CRM creators to help us with that, or create these outside spaces where we're monitoring and maintaining that so that we can create our own models? And I think at the end of the day, we're all going to end up with these really individual models of different types of, you know, I don't want to call them personas in this way, but kind of like where we have so many different types of models that represent what our goals are and how we're going to get there. So just my 2 cents on that one.
Catherine?
Yeah, I think that similar to what we were talking about before, and I think you both really touched on this, but it's there's engagement metrics that we can measure that are part of the annual giving work that we do. It does, though, become really, really difficult to synthesize those things. I know that in my shop, because I'm using, I mean, I kind of have like 10 standard channels that I run many campaigns through, and I collect data from each of those separately from each other. And then I've got to come up with some sort of way to kind of synthesize that into one campaign and to get results from one thing. That's a lot of work. And it's a thing that I've been trying for years to do as campaigns are ending, but you know, things drag on and on and on, and people go back to emails for a really long time, or they're sending you gift slips from 2 years ago. And it's kind of hard to say when a campaign ends. We're always marketing, we're always asking, we're always sort of in a campaign, as it were. It's not as cut and dry as it was years ago when there was kind of a start and an end. You sent something, it came back, and you were done. So finding ways to synthesize all of the data from the various resources that you have is something that I do find challenging. We've sort of created metrics that are associated with some of our bigger channels. So texting is a huge platform for us, and we've developed what is a kind of, for us, kind of a benchmark of a good response rate and a good actual transaction rate for text, so that now that we've been doing it long enough, I can say, well, this campaign did well, this campaign did better than usual, this campaign fell flat for some reason, and we have to think about the messaging because it didn't quite work. But it took us some time, you know, it took kind of 2 years of data till we could start to develop for us what was a good benchmark for that platform. And it's completely different than my social metrics. You know, the metrics that I track around the ads that I run for social media, because that's how we do most of our messaging is through ads, not through organic posts, because of the way Colgate has their pages set up. Those metrics are entirely different. And I can't use one to help inform the other. Unfortunately, I have to develop them channel by channel. So I think that finding those channels that are performing for you and seeing what your real standard kind of operation is, so you know where you can improve, is something that has to be done kind of case by case, you know, institution by institution, depending on what platforms you're using. And then also take some time to build the data set so that you know what you're really working with and where you can improve.
You know, one of the challenges I see often is that, like, especially with new channels or in the segmentation, in testing things, like sometimes the N is just so small that you're like, I don't know that this is even valid. Like it's like, oh, then you go with a gut check or something. And so I think that's a real challenge as we're trying new things and looking at responses. It's just, how do we kind of validate, or what other ways can we, without using a statistically valid measure, can we get something out of what we're doing? So.
Christina, you must see that all the time in your work, that just because we can have 250 segments doesn't mean we necessarily can justify.
No. It's hard too, because like it at some level, like there's validity in doing a lot of different segments. I think, just as we were just talking about, by modeling and creating these ways and these communications methods that really speak to how people are responding or want to be spoken to. And then on the other side, we have people who are segmenting just for the hell of segmenting. Heck, of segmenting.
Really? Imagine that.
And so, yeah. But it's like, it seems so much more interesting when there are 200 segments, when really it could just be one. So.
Kerry, we should probably bring up, for anybody who doesn't know, all those sort of old leaky bucket statistics, especially first-time donor retention. You know, sometimes the criticism, if that's the right word, of giving days, and maybe now student emergency funds, is that you'll get a donor to give once, but how do you keep those donors? And the biggest jump I think a lot of places could affect, this goes back to your short-term question with participation, is maybe just zeroing in on those first-time donors. And if you're not even aware who those are, that would be good to begin to identify who those folks are. And I think, you know, it doesn't make giving days a bad thing. It means you're not doing a good job of keeping those people once they pop up. So, I mean, if I had one short-term idea that we haven't already touched on, it might just be aware of who those fragile donors are and show them the love.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think we've talked about this in staff a lot, the volatility of that donor churn that's been caused, I think, by giving days. Sure, it gives us kind of a short-term boost to the goose, but we do need to be mindful about those individuals. And I think this comes back to kind of that stewardship piece of being, you know, we're coming at them very strong with an initiative that is very compelling. You know, it's lowered their threshold of motivation, right? So they do give. How do we retain them? How do we make it something that is less transactional, less in the moment, to more of a relational piece? Certainly something that would help in the short term. Yeah. That donor churn percentage is interesting. I actually also look at just to kind of set the bar, I think, for my leadership, I look at board participation or volunteer participation, because if our most engaged individuals are not yet at that level of participation that they want the rest of the institution to actually reach, we have to you know, restructure how we're thinking about that. And what the reason for that is. So, you know, a typical metric that I use is if board participation should be at least double of what that, you know, base threshold that we're looking for from the general population. Any others? Any other interesting metrics? No? All right.
You want to ask a question from the Q&A?
Yes, I
Well,
was just, yes. Why
You'll
not?
regret it, and I owe you another apology because it's a Venmo question. But this is a good straight. I mean, whatever you decide about using Venmo or not, I think operationally how you use Venmo. I mean, the
Yes.
question I think is how you figure out who the donor is.
Yes.
Probably works better at a small institution than a bigger institution. But just say a word about that, if you will.
Oh, sure. So what we do, this has to do a lot with, I think, how we train our students to give in general, but specifically, we are a small shop, and a small institution. So there's a very personal relationship with each student and almost every person in my department. But on a very basic level, we ask the student for their name, their class year, and where they want the gift designated. We don't have more than, roughly 280, 300 students per class. So it's pretty easy. The likelihood of, multiple John Smiths is pretty low. But the class year does help kind of that distinction on the back end.
Okay, got it. One more too, while I'm looking at it, about the relationship that you all have with your alumni relations colleagues and how they can help with things like participation. I can think of including giving in event registrations, things like that. Anything you all want to say about our friends across the hall in alumni relations? Catherine, anything on that?
Yeah, at Colgate, we really intentionally work to build a very strong partnership between alumni relations and annual giving for this very reason. So I actually just helped to lead a meeting yesterday. That's our monthly meeting between these two departments. And for us, that's a lot of people. It's almost 20 of us all together in a Zoom room yesterday, usually in a conference room, where we're coming together and making sure that the projects that we have that overlap and align with each other, that we are really kind of working, as I say, as partners on those things and not siloed, which I realize can be a really difficult thing to do, just depending on how your school's organized and history and things like that. But there are some really great things that lend to good and important partnership with alumni relations. Reunion and reunion giving is such an obvious example. Your friends in alumni relations are working on reunion programming. You are working, or you have potential to be working on reunion giving programs. And those two things should be, in sync with each other. They should be using similar branding and similar language, and they should be supporting each other. So we have class managers that are assigned to all of our reunion classes, and then we've got a partner for each one of those who's kind of the program manager for those classes in alumni relations. We work very closely with them and make sure that we're in touch with each other and aware of what the other one is doing, so that we're appearing to speak as one university, because we are, and helping to meet each other's goals. So I think that's one place where you can find a lot of really obvious crossover. Another place where we've seen some great crosswork is with recent alumni. It's a challenge, they're a challenging group when it comes to giving for many reasons. They also have a lot of opportunity for alumni relations. You want to get those folks engaged with your university, whether they're giving or not. You want them engaging, right? So to have partnership around events for recent alumni that have a fundraising message related to them, or we worked with alumni relations on a marketing piece that would go out to graduated seniors that talks about the alumni network and everything that's available to them and how we continue to be here to support them as alumni. That also had a little fundraising piece, but as part of it, because that is part of how you can continue to be involved. But to look at those places where your work really does cross over and find ways to partner with them is a great way to keep you in sync and meeting each other's goals, supporting each other's goals.
Christina, if you put on your state university hat for a minute, anything to add from that point of view?
I think from the bigger state universities, there are kind of two different camps, right? Are you still a membership model for your alumni association or not? And so, but at the end of the day, how that plays out is really just a shell game of resources, right? So, or of dollars in the door. So it's, whether or not you're seeing it come in as a membership fee, and then that's going to support the cost of the Alumni Association, or if the Alumni Association is underwritten by the university or the foundation, and then or is its own thing, but funded by some other mechanism. So at the end of the day, it's kind of the same dollars, just as how are they representing them and presenting them. So So with that being said, I think everyone, I think this is the trend, and we're seeing this, and the communication is there and the conversation is there. And I see like Yvette from Delaware, I think you're on right now. I think you guys are doing some pretty good stuff in that space as well. And it's not just alumni relations, but it's also the career services office. I think those three offices together are really presenting the best opportunity to really engage with our alums and keep them activated, and using that as, I think, going back to that metric idea, using those three together to look back at participation or engagement scoring, those types of things. I think those are really great places to look. So.
Yeah, this seems like a simple answer, but I think it really goes back to kind of your institutional strategy, right? I think you really have to kind of lift a little bit and start at that 40,000 foot and identify what the question is you're asking and what that goal is and who needs to be at the table. I think we have a tendency, right, especially now in a virtual setting, to be a little isolated, to be a little bit, operating on our own, because sometimes it's easier. I get it, totally. It's easier to just kind of execute, right? But I do think that leadership is necessary to kind of sit back and say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish as an institution, as advancement, as giving and engagement, and what are some of the ideas that we both have that we can contribute together to meet in one space, exactly as Catherine said. I think I don't know if any of my colleagues are on this call, so maybe I'm giving away some of my secrets. But the opportunity effectively to collaborate, like find areas where your engagement professionals need help, right? Reunion's a great example. Are there areas where you can collaborate, right? A lot of the communications that we put out, we seek to try and find some areas that we can promote some of their things in our appeals, or our acknowledgement letters, and vice versa. Are there areas where they can, insert an ask? And we're more than willing to kind of help them and educate them, create that copy. I think the hesitance to ask is more of a situation where they just don't, they're not professionals in this space like we are, right? And so they don't know how to ask, and they don't want to be perceived as uneducated in this way. And so if it's helpful to give them, to kind of lead them along, that's what my recommendation would be.
Kerry, can I ask Christina a question?
Of course.
The rest of you can chime in too. So I'll be honest, in my perfect world, premium mailings would not exist. And I want to believe that people have the capacity to give out of a purely philanthropic point of view. But if I had a dollar for every place I've worked with where they said, actually, that address label mailing is about the strongest performing thing that we do. So while we're here in a participation conversation, tell us how we ought to think about premium mailings, especially, I guess, if we've tried everything else and we've still got a boss and a president that are all saying, what are we doing about participation?
I think you treat premium mailings as the day of giving of direct mail.
I like
that. So I think there are two things that we can do with these premium mailings, right? Number one is thinking back to that N, and how, not the N that we was talking about last time, but like just the N of participation. If we think about, okay, if we have updated information on these people, then they count. If we don't, they don't, right? So doing some sort of outreach digitally and by mail, because we have to remember, like, just because we have an email address or they're engaging with us here doesn't mean they're going to fill it out. So you have to cross-channel update information. So I think that's number one. And then number two, using premiums as like an incentive. You've got to have, sometimes you just need a carrot. Making sure you're not just like blasting premiums out there too. I think that then it feels a little less special, and it's also harder to figure out, did this work or not, right? Because if you're sending it to a Cybont, well, maybe that happened, maybe they would have given anyway. But really targeting your not yet donors, long lapsed, those types of things. But then also with partnering on a day of giving too, and using premiums there. Sorry, I know Delaware's on here, they've been doing some really cool pennant stuff and things with their days of giving, and I really like that. And I think they're being smart about the designs they're using. They're creative. I think another school that's doing some great stuff around Day of Giving and kind of keeping things kind of sassy and fun, also important, particularly as we look at our Gen Zers, right? Is Virginia Tech. They're doing some fantastic design work and really thinking about premiums in a creative way. So that being said, people love labels. I mean, it's crazy, but, and like people are like, well, no one's mailing things anymore, so why would you need address labels for water bottles for daycare? People, come on. So, there's a whole nother space there. And so I think, you know, maybe it becomes that the address labels aren't address labels, but they're those kind of like semi-permanent labels that you can put on almost anything and stick for a while and go through the washer. So,
well, your direct mail giving day, that's brilliant. And and isn't it funny how we use a lot of devices in annual giving? Premiums are one, giving day is one, reunion giving is really another one. But the challenge is always that gets people to self-identify. It's still our responsibility to have something in mind for, you know, then where do you lead them after that, right? To just dismiss the idea that caused them to pop up, I think, is overlooking the purpose of it in the first place, right? Sorry, you got me.
And I think to that point, and back to the question we actually just had about alumni relations, I think sorry, looking at he or she did not share their name, but their question about like if they're adverse to including giving as an engagement point, your alumni relations team, like how can you kind of get them on board? And one place where I think we have a lot of need, as Kerry's identified in annual giving, and we don't always do the best job or have the best resources in meeting it, is in sharing impact and sharing how philanthropy is raising, you know, lifting up the ability of students right now, is transforming faculty interactions with students and things like that. And it might be a softer way if you've got a hesitant or nervous alumni relations partner to getting them on board with your work and your message and being a partner with you. Perhaps instead of starting with the asking side, you're starting with the impact side, and can they help you share those impact stories? Which kind of, you know, marries that idea, Bob, that you're talking about keeping them. Like if we're doing all this work to bring them in, can alumni relations help us with keeping them? I think that's an interesting thing to kind of explore.
Good.
Yeah, this is sort of an aside, but there is kind of a theory in social psychology, right? That identity proposition that I think our engagement folks can really help us with. The idea of like, you know, you wear the t-shirt because you love the institution. You put the sticker on the water bottle because you love the institution. We can't overlook that. It's really powerful. So I think that's a great way to get them involved. Catherine, yeah.
Another question from somebody listening in. Have any of you explored how artificial intelligence and machine learning can help you do better analytics to determine who has affinity with your organizations? This may not be a question that applies to every institution, but I also appreciate that I at least now know what that is. Anybody have something to say on that subject? You know, there's the companies out there like Gravity, I think, is one that are all in that space a little bit. I'm not sure it's completely applying to everybody at the moment, but anybody with an answer to that?
I was, a couple years ago, Cornell hosted a CASE, like a one-day conference about, Bob, I think you were supposed to be there and we had a snowstorm or something.
It snowed, yeah, it snowed. I was going to fly into Buffalo, I got snowed out.
Yeah, and it was specifically about AI and advancement. And I went down and I helped to lead a session about annual giving and AI. And it, you know, it wasn't because because it wasn't because I know these things. I was coming from the annual giving perspective, and I was partnered with someone in the AI field, and it was a workshop. You know, I wasn't standing there saying, "How you do it all?" Because I don't know. It was a fascinating conversation to think about how machine learning, really not so much AI, but really how machine learning has evolved. And we are utilizing a lot of tools in a lot of our shops, whether it's through social media or through more advanced email platforms that we're using. Like there's a lot of things that we're using that have the ability to capture data and start to develop personas, as it were, or give us some better sense of how to target and message to to different populations, right? Because what we do in annual giving is so different than our friends and major guests, because we're not working with this portfolio of individual people. We're working with thousands of people, and we can't know them individually. We have to be able to group them. It gives this really interesting ability to be able to group in ways that are not those kind of historical ones we use in annual giving, like donor history or graduation year, you know, some things like that. However, as fascinating as I find it and as intrigued as I am by it, I haven't implemented any of it myself. I keep feeling like I've got to get some other things under my belt first before I go down that route. It's something that I am really interested to explore. Kerry, are you doing anything in that field right now?
Ooh, I was going to say, have I explored it? Yes. Have I decided that this would be a brilliant thesis project for a student? Yes. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to recruit a couple of economics students to help me out here. No, this is, I agree with you 100%. I love this idea of being able to take, you know, complex data sets and make it much more scalable, right? I mean, this is something that we would love to do as a profession. I think there's just never enough time to kind of sit down and say, all right, I need to hire a company, or I need to teach myself how to code, you know? So yeah, stay tuned. I'm hopeful to have more to report in the future.
And I believe there are some large research institutions that are starting to implement some of these things because they have some resources in-house.
Yes.
Oh gosh, Bob, last year's senior annual giving conference, the data guy.
Andrew, right?
Not
Or
Andrew.
Roger Devine, yeah.
Roger Devine. Roger Devine is starting to look at some of these things, but again, they've got resources. Well, he's brilliant, you know, all by himself. But they've got resources there that other institutions may not have kind of in-house to start to develop some of these things. And so I think that some of their learnings could be really helpful if this is something that that organizations are starting to explore or to question. I think there's tons of potential, but still rather cutting edge for our industry.
Roger, I would add parenthetically, was chairing the CASE Drive conference that was also happening this week. But got canceled while others did not. Just saying. Sorry, but I digress. doesn't mean my data sense is any better than his.
I look at the machine learning things as like a giant game of like multiple games of the game Mousetrap. How, like, you know, all these different levels and like if this happens then that, and how do we put that together and visualize it in a way that makes it really easy for non-computery people to understand as well. I think that's important because there's only so much coding and such that we can all do before it just starts to kind of like flip away from our brains. So.
I have a good participation question for you guys from our friend Tori in Reno. When, if ever, do you stop soliciting alumni non-donors, and will you ever try again, even after a certain period of time of not trying? That's straightforward. Love to hear what MCR says with this too.
Ooh, gosh. I mean, I guess I'll kick this one off.
Yeah, sorry, I was supposed to identify somebody.
No, totally fine. I have a little bit of a caveat here in the sense that at CMC we're very lucky that like true never donors are a very, very small percentage of our population. Because the majority of our alumni make their first gift in their senior class year, and we can retain them very well into the next year. So, you know, we'll see something like an 80% participation rate for a senior class gift, and then we retain at least 50 to 60% of them in the next year. So, but a key piece of that is actually our phone program. So in terms of pure nevers, that right now I still feel like is our best source of engaging an individual who has never, ever made a gift. So we don't ever take them out of the population.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Tori's asking, she's at the University of Nevada in Reno. Tori, the secret weapon that Kerry has, and I think Catherine's probably going to reference too, is reunion giving, which means
True.
that bus comes around every 5 years and is a very compelling reason to get back on the bus, right? But then that gets criticized. Well, how do we keep them after reunions? The same thing with the address labels and the giving days. So Catherine, didn't mean to interrupt, but just to understand, some schools have different assets in this conversation than others.
Yeah, I think, Kerry and I and the types of institutions that we're at, the idea of spending time and resource to reach out to nevers is something that is not overwhelming or frightening or seems wasteful to us at all. I haven't always been at a place like Colgate, though. I was at a mid-sized regional institution for a number of years, and it was an entirely different type of work that I was doing there. And I didn't have the resources to invest a lot of time and money in never donors because, I had a lot more alumni, a lot more never donors, and a lot less staff and other resources to focus my efforts on. So while I solicit nevers every year, multiple times a year through different channels. And then I do work to retain them. I do keep an eye on them. But I realize that's not the case for everybody. And I think it would be worthwhile for organizations that don't have that luxury to consider a never donor program and to consider kind of diversifying those asks. So maybe you can't reach out to all of them every year because it just doesn't allow with what your with what your resources allow. But perhaps if you can kind of cut them up into some different groups and maybe you can try a texting program with them one year, that's one way where we've seen real, if you just don't have the bandwidth in your phone-a-thon to make the phone calls, texting is a great way to try and make a personal connection and engage and allow a never donor to actually speak up and tell you why they don't give, or tell you, by the way, you've been contacting the wrong phone number all these years, or whatever the case may be. That's one way you could look at trying to re-engage a never in a way that an email is a little bit less personal. But I would hesitate to pull them out completely, but I also understand that people have different resources that they're dealing with, and you've got to focus on what's really going to drive your metrics, right? And if your university's focus is really on dollars, then I would spend more time with my donors, because your donors are your most loyal donors, and I would work on increasing their giving more than I would invest in trying to get new people on board. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
I'll just add, for a place like Tori's at a state university, this is, again, goes back to our engagement awareness, right? That if somebody's never given, but I can at least see they have a pulse and they read things we send out, or they come to events, or all those other social media metrics that we should know more about, that I should know more about. Now you've got a way to sift through that big dark bucket of non-donors. So, how do I see who's raising their hand? I think applies to every size institution, whether you're, the small colleges that benefit from the reunion bus, or whether you're a big state university.
I think the way I look at it is, particularly for not yet donors or the regional and large universities, like, we're basically, depending upon how we're reaching out to them, we're asking them to like randomly buy a TV, even if they don't want a TV, right? And they don't even know why they would need a TV. But we're asking them to do something that they're not quite accustomed to us asking them to do, particularly if we're not reaching out to them regularly. But also, having known the resource side of things, like, so you need to encourage them to want a TV. Like, why would they want a TV? Well, here's the reason they want a TV. They want to be able to, all the reasons we want these things, right? So with your not yet donors, making sure that there's some sort of way to educate them and keep those messages front of mind before asking is just, I think that's key. And then I think segmenting and testing groups and realizing, I don't know if it was Kerry or Catherine who said that, not reaching out to to all of them all the time. And so maybe you have to alternate years or alternate halves of the year or whatever it is, but you have resources, you need to use them wisely. I totally get it, Tori. So yeah, but if you're going to ask them to buy a TV, they have to at least want a TV. So yeah.
There you go. Kerry, I hope your inbox hasn't filled up with mails from your legal team at Claremont McKenna.
Nothing yet.
There's a couple other questions that maybe we could just ask after we're done. But did you have any sort of parting question to challenge us with?
Oh gosh, parting questions. What is the big one, right? What's the future of alumni participation rates? Which I'm not sure we can answer. Anyone want to take a crack at in the short term, in the new age that we're in right now? I know we talked a little bit about participation rates this year, but I guess just what would you hope for your institution or for all institutions in the next 6 months and then beyond?
I think it's important to look at alumni participation, not so much as a percentage, but as a whole number. Are you increasing your whole number of participants year over year? Now, I realize our graduating classes are bigger than our older classes. And so, but I think that's where we put ourselves on this weird cycle of, again, having to run faster and faster just to maintain where we are right now. We've really moved away and outside of places where we have to from reporting percentage so much as whole number, because I think there's a lot of validity in being able to say to your leadership, our percentage may have gone down, but our overall number of donors is going up and it's continuing to increase. And I also think that paying close attention kind of to eras of donors so that you can watch closely if you're folks from the 80s, you're folks from the 90s, they're continuing to increase their giving, their dollar amounts are continuing to increase. That's great. What's happening with your recent alumni? Clearly they're slower, they're not building as fast, but honestly, that's been an issue for a really long time. It's not new to the current most current generation of recent alumni. So to be able to look at them a little bit, instead of one big participation lump, break them up a little bit, really see where you stand. Because what I think you might find is, even if you feel like you're falling behind, you may see you're really making great strides with some of your eras, and others need more work and attention. And that's a great way to sort of gauge where your successes really are, where your opportunities really lie, and the work that you're doing.
I can't even improve on that. That was well said.
Yeah.
And just remember that we're frustrated with alumni participation as the metric, but that doesn't mean we're opposed to a broad base of support, right? To what you said.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Don't kill the messenger, right? We're just.
No, I echo exactly what Catherine said. I think I've had greatest success in converting, I think, the important metric from being a participation rate or a percentage to a donor count, right? Trying to increase that alumni donor base is huge, and being able to also show year over year how you're growing that base is also a helpful, or even arguably a better metric. So there's hope for us yet. There is. We can do this. Any last?
Christina, anything else?
And just blow it all up.
Kerry, I just want to say thank you for doing this. Who needs rehearsal? This was great. And the only other thing I want to say is, can I get your commitment to drive the 5 miles next year and come on over in person from Claremont McKenna?
Done. Sold. Excellent.
That's recorded. Great. Thanks very much again, everybody. Terrific. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Thank you very much to Catherine and Christina for joining me very last minute, and much thanks to Bob for making this all happen. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you all. Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you. Have a great morning or afternoon.